What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. When it comes to Hearthstone, there's a lot of common mistakes that players typically make, and some of them might seem like pretty common sense things, but others are a little bit more out there, and all of these are things that come up quite often in games, and knowing them will definitely help level up your Hearthstone skill. So let's jump right into it, and if you guys enjoy the video, hit that like button, and if you don't, hit that dislike. Our first common mistake is a little bit of a minor one, and it's when warrior players use up armor instead of taking face damage. A lot of times you'll see warrior players doing things like armoring up or shield blocking first and then swinging with their weapon afterwards. And this is bad pretty much regardless of whatever version of warrior you're playing. If you're playing the card Shield Slam in your deck, then you would rather have the same amount of armor rather than that amount of health because you want to be able to Shield Slam to kill anything. As well, if you or your opponent is playing Alexstrasza, then you want your life total to be closer to or lower than 15 and have a lot of armor rather than having a high life total and then no armor. And this is because Alex can of course change your life total but not affect your armor, so it's better to minimize the negative impact that an Alexstrasza can have on you. And this applies if you're playing Reno or healing effects as well, and also especially if you're playing the card Battle Rage, you want your life total to be damaged so that you can draw more cards rather than having no armor and being at a full life total. And even if you aren't playing any of those cards, by following these practices you can bluff your opponent to make it look like you are actually playing Shield Slam or Battle Rage, and thus potentially causing them to play around cards that you don't actually have. And this one is pretty simple to fix, just make sure that you're always armoring up after you use your weapon to hit something, thus maximizing your armor and minimizing your health. Our second common mistake is not drawing cards first. This one's pretty straightforward and logical. Let's say you have a 5-drop and maybe an Arcane Intellect in your hand. Way too often I see players play the 5-drop and then cast Arcane Intellect afterwards. Well, so what's the problem there? The turn was mana efficient, they played a minion and drew some cards. The problem is the ordering. If you know for a fact that you're going to use mana to cast a draw spell or effect like Arcane Intellect, or perhaps the most famous one's probably Life Tap, then you should always be doing that as the first thing on your turn. And the reason why is that there's always a potential for you to draw cards that you might want to cast more than the other card that you had planned on initially playing that turn, and you still have the mana available to do it. Going back to our example, if you play the 5-drop and then perhaps draw maybe a better 5-drop that you'd rather play instead, you're out of luck if you drew cards last. But if you draw the cards first, you now have more options as a result and can choose a potentially better one if you get a lucky top deck. Sure, sometimes you'll mostly still end up playing the card you already had in your hand, but if you know for sure that you're going to cast the draw spell, it's always better to just cast it first in every situation. Our third common mistake is when players use their coin too aggressively. This is a fairly complicated issue and could honestly kind of be its own topic, but we'll try to give you a brief summary. The coin should essentially be used to smooth out your entire mana curve. This means that you should use it to help be mana efficient, essentially to spend all of your mana every turn as the game goes on. A very common example of what you should do is that if you have a 2-drop in your hand and then 2 3-drops in your hand along with the coin. While this kind of depends on what the cards are and of course what your opponent's doing, usually you just want to wait until turn 2 to coin out a 3-drop and then play another 3-drop on turn 3. That way you get to play 2 3-drops in a row, and on turn 4 you can play your 2-drop and use your hero power. And this is much better than just coining the 2-drop out on turn 1 and then hero powering on turn 2 and then playing a 3-drop on turn 3 and then playing a 3-drop on turn 4 as well. It's much less mana efficient and overall it's much less powerful. And a lot of the time you see players just coining out the 2-drop in the first place because they want to get something on the board. A good way to solve this problem is trying to visualize and predict your mana curve for the future turns. Just always be thinking about what's in your hand and imagining what order you might play those cards in and how you can make that as efficient of a process as possible. Our fourth common mistake is drawing cards when close to fatigue. This one's a little bit straightforward, but it's probably one of the more common mistakes on the list, even at, high levels of play like on the Legend ladder. If you're playing a game of Hearthstone and you think it's highly likely that a game will end in fatigue, well, you should stop drawing cards altogether. Of course, there's going to be exceptions to this, like if you're digging for your win condition, or if you need to draw cards to answer your opponent's win condition, then you have to go for it, you're forced to. But if it's something like a Control Warrior Mirror matchup, and you know for sure that the game is going to go to fatigue, and you're maybe getting to a pretty low card count, just stop drawing cards altogether. Too often players cast shield blocks that, rather than gaining them 5 armor, end up losing them 30 health because of how much closer it brought them to fatigue. Now if your opponent is drawing a lot of cards, you might be able to draw some too, but make sure you keep more cards in your library than your opponent so that you can win the game when it goes to fatigue at the end. Our fifth mistake involves not understanding spell interactions, more specifically using preparation and coin or perhaps other similar interactions in the wrong order. And this is probably one of the more simpler mistakes, and if you've been playing Hearthstone for a while, you almost certainly know about this, but it's also probably the worst mistake to make on the list, so we figured it was worth mentioning. So preparation reduces the cost of any spell by 3, and of course the coin is a spell, which means that if you want to prep coin a sprint on turn 3, you of course want to coin first. If you prep the coin, it's the coin that's going to get that cost reduction, and then your sprint will cost the full 7 mana, and by messing up the order you cost yourself a preparation, and possibly the coin too if you didn't have a good 4-drop. A similar interaction is potentially also trying to coin a Mountain Giant. Mountain Giant of course costs 1 less for each card in your hand, so by coining it you're giving yourself a mana, but also making Mountain Giant a mana more expensive. So you totally just waste the coin. When playing a deck or using an interaction that you're unfamiliar with, make sure to either look it up or perhaps just think critically about the way the mechanics work so you avoid making any simple mistakes that might cost you a game. Our next mistake is perhaps one that's a little bit more complicated to explain, and it's missing lethal. So despite how simple this one looks on paper, it's definitely something that needs to be mentioned. I mean, too often, even in tournaments sometimes, players miss the chance to kill their opponent, and as a result give their opponent a chance to get back into the game. There's almost an infinite amount of different situations and possible lethal combinations. So of course we can't just talk about them individually, but we can cover a pretty simple series of steps to go through on turns where you have the potential for lethal. Every turn, especially when your opponent is starting to get low, think about whether there's any way you could kill them or any cards you might draw that could kill them as well. Even if you don't draw them, by actively thinking about their life total and how to kill them in the future and on future turns, you won't get too caught up on the board state or on the game to just miss lethal completely. Especially when you have a lot of creatures on the board, you should always be thinking stuff like, what would happen if I just went face with everything here? Our seventh common mistake is positioning. Positioning is another topic that we could talk about for a bunch of videos, but we'll again try to just give you a quick summary. And for those of you who might not know, when I say positioning, I'm talking about in what order your minions are on the board from left to right relative to each other. So why is this kind of thing important? Well, let's say you have a totem golem on the board and you're about to play a Tuskar totemic. What side should you put it on? The correct answer is of course to always put it on the left side, because the Tuskar totemic always makes the totem to the right of itself, and it has the potential to make a flame tongue totem, so your totem golem would get the immediate buff only if you play the Tuskar to the left of it. Positioning is usually only important when it comes to cards that buff adjacent cards, stuff like Direwolf, Defender of Argus, Flame Tongue Totem, etc., maybe Cone of Cold. And most importantly, this also applies to cards that generate those respective positioning cards from randomness. Stuff like Piloted Shredder and Tuskar Totemic are great examples. And when playing with these cards, it's important to consider which minions you want to be buffed and which order you want to trade your minions in. Try to position your more expendable minions towards the middle, since you can play something like Flame Tongue smack in the middle of your board, trade those minions, and then have your better minions finally get the buff at the end, since the weaker minions died when you traded in with them. Positioning is something you should always consider, and definitely something that can improve your play a ton. And our next common mistake that we see is not playing around obvious lethals from your opponent. This one's also pretty simple, but it is something that happens all the time. If your opponent has a board full of creatures and you're trying to decide whether you want to clear the board or go face, you always need to consider what cards they could have had that would give them lethal. For example, against maybe a token druid deck, you should probably clear their board since they might kill you with a Savage Roar. If you're playing Control Warrior against a mage and you're at 7 life, you should probably armor instead of playing your big minions since you're dead to a Fireball plus a hero power. This is something that requires awareness of the meta a little bit and what cards could be in your opponent's deck, as well as just constant vigilance. Just try to pay attention and figure out what deck your opponent is playing, and then think about all of the possible ways they might be able to kill you based on the game state. If there's something you could do pretty easily to prevent them from killing you, you probably should play around it. Of course, there are situations where you have to decide whether to develop your board or play around some super obscure or lethal possibility, and the instincts to make these decisions correctly is kind of what separates good players from the great players. So either way, it's definitely something you always want to be considering. Anyway, those are just some common, more basic mistakes that we see a lot, so let us know if there's others you'd like us to cover in the comments. And looks like that's going to be it for me. If you guys enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.